Sharyl Attkisson is a rare breed in today's media because she is a fearless, hard-hitting, investigative journalist with a capital J. And she doesn't allow the media mafia to determine what she covers and which are the right questions to ask. So very thrilled to have her here. I want you to welcome the host of the Public Affairs show, Full Measure, and author of a brand new blockbuster book called Follow the Science. Give a big welcome to Sharyl Attkisson. Sharyl, I don't have many heroes in the field of journalism, but of the very small number of 2 or 3, you're at the top of the list, and I'm honored you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You have written a book called Follow the Science that, quite frankly, a lot of people don't want to let you talk about. Why are people so afraid of this book?
I think it exposes something that the public has long been familiar with, but for some reason our medical establishment, they don't want to talk about it. And I posit the reasons why with, I think, a lot of hard data and evidence. We're talking about, people know there's this corrupting relationship between the media and the pharmaceutical industry because the pharmaceutical industry buys advertising, spends billions of dollars, it can influence the content. We know the pharmaceutical industry influences our political figures by making donations to the top of both political parties so that they will not hold congressional hearings about certain topics. They're allowed to help write the laws and policies. But there's a really critical element that I don't think we've talked about enough, and the book explores that. Why the medical establishment doesn't seem to notice the explosion in chronic diseases that has happened under all of our noses in the past 20 years. They're treating it and throwing pills at it, but not looking at root causes, seeming to ignore it and not notice it all the way up to the federal agency level. And it's because of the same corrupting influences that I think are endemic in this whole system.
You know, I think it's fair to say, Sharyl, we don't have a healthcare system in America. We have a sick care system in America. It's not about getting people healthy. It's about treating the diseases. And it would appear, and I think this is the point you make, that there is evidence that indicates that some of the things that we are now faced with in a health crisis may be, at least in part, the result of over-medicating the American population. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so, absolutely. And so it's twofold. There can be problems that come with over-medicating the population, and in a related issue with all of the chemicals and pesticides in our ordinary food and our ordinary water and environment that the government not only approves but almost forces into our food supply. But there's the whole idea that when they're pushing medicine at us, they're not looking at the root cause to prevent these things from happening. And I argue this starts in medical school. The pharmaceutical industry actually writes what some people consider the most popular reference book for medical students. It's called the Merck Manual, written by the drug company Merck. So I look to see what the Merck Manual teaches young budding doctors about its own controversies, its payments of hundreds of millions of dollars to settle fraud charges and kickbacks and bribery, its allegedly dangerous drugs. Nothing in there about any of that. Doctors are frequently taught to look away, basically, when these problems arise, and that starts in medical school.
You know, you were famously a part of CBS for a long, long time, investigative reporter. You've won Emmys after Emmys after Emmys, and one day you said, that's it. Obviously, you saw something in the world of journalism that was troubling to you, and you became an independent journalist. What was it that made you realize that there's something very, very corrupt going on in what used to be an honorable profession of reporting?
Well, I left CBS about 10 years ago and lucked into the independent program that I host now, Full Measure. But I had tried to work those last couple of years within a very changing system, which we now recognize all as a sort of a bad, corrupt media environment, but it was switching over about that time. And I think because I was investigative reporting at CBS, I was on the front end of having the impact of this improper influence on our stories. It impacted me first.
Yeah.
It ultimately impacted everybody, but I saw this influence pretty early. And it started, believe it or not, around the 2003 time period when CBS assigned me to cover medical controversies. And we started getting pushback as the networks developed these partnerships for advertising with the drug companies, lobbying with them side by side before Congress to loosen up the rules that used to not permit drug advertising on TV. And at the same time, now looking back, one part of the news division wanted these high-impact stories about pharmaceutical dangers. We were all covering them. But there started to be this pushback about that time with other facets of the company saying, more or less, we don't like these stories and we shouldn't be doing them. And now, gosh, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't even have to reach into the newsrooms and censor because everybody self-censors. They understand where their bread is buttered. They don't even try to cover these stories anymore.
That is so disturbing because what you're really saying is that the pharmaceutical companies have so much power because they have so much money that they pretty much can dictate to news organizations, you don't touch the stories that might make us look bad because you're making money off us, we're making money off the people, everybody's making money, but the population is getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And that's really disturbing. We are back with award-winning journalist Sharyl Attkisson discussing the media's collusion with the medical and pharmaceutical establishment. This is the book. It's called Follow the Science. And Sharyl, that's exactly what we were told during COVID. Follow the science. Anthony Fauci stood up there every day and said, we got to follow the science. And then it turned out the science wasn't there for all the stuff like wearing masks. We weren't supposed to wear them, then we were. Have a vaccine, it'll keep us from getting the virus. Turned out it didn't keep us from getting the virus. We were lied to.
Well, follow the science turned into sort of a code word for don't listen to your cognitive dissonance, don't do your own research, just do what we're telling you to do. And I think a lot of people were awakened during COVID who had never really thought about these broader issues that we're trying to attack now about our chronic health disorders and the corruption in our medical establishment. Most people, I think, were like I used to be. You think your doctors know all the best science. You can't imagine researchers wouldn't tell the truth. You think peer-reviewed published studies are the gold standard. And it turns out that even by those whistleblowers inside the industry, we know none of that is necessarily true.
The CDC, the FDA told us a lot of things during COVID that turned out not to be true. And you know, the sad part about that, we've lost faith in institutions that we need to have trust in. We need to believe they're telling us the truth. And I think most of us, after we experienced, we didn't know. You know, we're trying to follow the science. And it turns out they were just following the pharmaceutical companies and doing sort of what they were told. And that's disturbing.
It is. And I think one of the worst outcomes is, even though accountability was promised, and even though some of CDC's staunchest defenders, and even a friend of Dr. Fauci's told me that after the debacle of COVID, that whole agency needs to be blown up from bottom to top. Nothing's happened. In fact, every year since then, Congress has given them huge budget increases. So if nobody's been held accountable, what's to be different next time?
I mean, it's only Rand Paul, seems like the one lonely voice crying in the wilderness who's still trying to get some accountability. There's an interesting part of your book. You talk about how the Amish population did everything differently than the science was telling them to do. They didn't close down. They didn't quit interacting with each other. They had an incredibly different result. And I want you to describe what the Amish did and how different their results were when they were supposed to be all dying off because they didn't follow the science they were told.
Well, they lived normal life. They allowed COVID to run through rather rapidly rather than stave it off with shutdowns. They made more money as a society that year than they'd ever made because they didn't close, they didn't shut their schools, they didn't test for COVID, they didn't vaccinate, they didn't go to hospitals. And their death outcome is arguably better, but definitely no worse. It's hard to get firm stats because they didn't do autopsies and have death results that said whether it was COVID or not. But you can look at the overall death rate and see that if they did nothing and yet fared better than we did when we destroyed our economy, destroyed our schools, spent all the money, used experimental vaccines, wow, what a better approach they had. But a great postscript to this is, after that story came out, which I did on Full Measure, some other reporters did it as well, the government funded a study that I think was designed to smear and debunk it. And when I dug into the study, I knew what they was trying to imply wasn't true, and I started challenging it. This was a work of propaganda, as many studies are today. And after a year of me challenging this study that tried to imply the Amish actually fared worse, finally, I heard in the last few days that they're issuing corrections, multiple corrections to this peer-reviewed published study. A little late because most doctors who read the original study aren't going to go back and look at the corrections, but at least I'm glad we were able to force corrections. My question is, who are the peer reviewers?
Yeah.
Why didn't the journal articles see, the journals itself that do their reviews, why didn't they see these flaws? This is not an uncommon story.
RFK Jr. Has been, just roundly criticized. People think he's a kook and he's a nut. He's been on this show, and I found him to be a fascinating individual, well-studied. He has said for a long time, he's not an anti-vaxxer. That's not fair. But he is saying that there needs to be very thorough research, especially about children. And is there a question of autism rates? Does it have something to do with vaccine? Is that one of the, like the third rail, you can't touch that issue and ask that question?
It is. And when you start as a reporter, see how a logical issue that should be followed is treated very strangely and differently in a way that defies common sense, you know these factions are at play. I went down the autism vaccine road because I was assigned to cover some of these stories at CBS and was shocked, as most people are when they dig in, to find there are peer-reviewed published studies that make a link, that the government has long ago acknowledged the link between vaccines and autism in court cases that it tried to have sealed so that nobody would find out they'd made these settlements. There are studies that the government, according to a whistleblower who currently works at CDC, where they tried to trash data, literally threw data in a trash can because it linked Black boys in Atlanta to higher rates of autism after certain vaccinations. There are a bunch of these stories that the government continually and the establishment tries to cover up and pretending that there's no link or the links have been disproven, which is not the case.
You know, this book is getting some real pushback. A lot of television networks, some that we like, won't let you come talk about this because they make too much money selling ads to the pharmaceutical companies. Are you surprised that it's that blatant to try to protect the advertising dollars?
I'm not. And I think when HarperCollins asked me to look at this topic, I think we knew that would be the case. Maybe a little surprised at how roundly the TV places that rely on pharmaceutical ads have rejected it, which is okay, because we have other places. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
But it's to be expected. This is how the system is run, and they don't really care that you know it. They simply don't want this information to get out and be heard in a fair forum.
We want to make sure it does get out, and this is the book. It's Sharyl's latest bestseller, Follow the Science. And I really believe that if you have an interest in why were things done like they were during COVID, she gives an explanation that will disturb you, but it will also make you be a little more prepared. The next time the government tells us to follow the science, we'll ask whose science and who's paying for it, and we'll have a much better picture of it.